retired from John Deere, but I became a Christian. Made sure I was born again at the University of Illinois. Learned to study the Bible with the Navigators. And in those days, I did want to make sure I was a Christian by inviting Jesus into my heart to forgive me all my sins. I wanted to make it a decision and not something that I inherited from my parents or anything else like that. Because it's a very personal thing. But even then, as I studied the Bible as much, or if not more, than any of my engineering books, I still had questions, like many of you, like what about the Lucy fossil, or dinosaurs, or carbon-14? All of those kind of questions. And so I started studying this question of creation, evolution, and been doing it for over 40 years now, and actively speaking for close to 10 to 12 years. And one of the things that I always had questions of was just what happened in those first chapter of Genesis, those verses, particularly the first 4 days. Because there's a lot of questions. Well, can you have light before the sun on day 4? Does that make sense? You can have light, I suppose, but can you have day, evening, and morning, and all that kind of stuff? So I've studied this, and then also with the help, as you'll see, of Dr. Russ Humphreys. I'll tell you more about him. This is my topic for tonight. Really, not so much the 6 days of creation, because day 5 and 6, I think most people have not too many questions about that, but especially the first 4. So let's begin. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Nobody has real problem with that if you're any kind of theistic believer. And what does that really mean? Well, it's like an opening statement or thesis, but it's also more than that. It's a statement. There is a creator, and we have the beginning of time. The creator existed before the beginning, because he couldn't be, somebody had to be there. And he says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, one interesting thing I've learned is that in Hebrew, there is no single word for universe. Not the universe as we know it, the entire cosmos of outer space and galaxies and stars and our solar system and so on. So really what this is telling us, God created the universe. And some people think there's a little bit of a gap then when you get to verse 2, or maybe this is just an opening statement, and it kind of is, but it's kind of telling us then, how did I do it? God tells us how he did it. And for me, I've approached this kind of like as an engineering project. You're going to set out, you have plans, you got an idea, you have something in mind which you want to build, and basically you're going to follow some series of steps. And so the rest of chapter 1 is how to build a universe in 6 easy steps. And that's what God outlines. And I'll go into more detail with this, but Genesis 1, 2 to 5 covers day 1 with the creation of matter, energy, and time. And then we get more into Earth itself and outer space. And this is the area that, there's a little controversy. Some of you, and I get pushback from all kinds of sides. People who believe in the canopy theory don't like how I'm going to treat this. Some people who believe in the, day-age theory and other things, like the framework, which I'll mention, they don't like how I do this either. But I'm looking at Scripture and using a little help from a very good physicist, Dr. Humphreys, and you'll see that. Day 3, we get land, grasses, and trees. And we'll get into what that really means. Then, of course, finally, sun, moon, and stars, sea creatures and birds, and day 6, land animals and Adam and Eve, people created in the image of God. And then we complete the week with the day of rest. And that week, that 7-day week with a day of rest, is a pattern that almost all cultures on earth follow. Even if they don't have the Bible, we just kind of follow that, and that's been the pattern throughout our human history. So first question I'm going to look at just briefly, just going to give you a little background. What about the gap theory? Now, this was one theory when the idea of millions and millions and billions of years got very popular, and that there must have been a gap between Genesis 1:1, creation of the universe, and then the rest of it is some of the details, but there is maybe millions, if not billions of years between verse 1 and 2. Thomas Chalmers, a Scottish theologian, he was perhaps one of the first ones pushing this idea. And it does have some interesting features. There are still people who believe this today, that in the beginning God created heaven and one, then you got a gap of billions of years, and then the earth was without form, and then we start focusing on what happens on the earth. But the part I have trouble with is that they keep adding to this, that what happened in that billions of years? Well, they talk about things like Lucifer's rebellion. There was another flood besides the Genesis flood, and that's where the old million-year-old fossils originated in that flood. There was another ice age. They just kind of pack a lot of stuff in there that I just don't see in the Bible, and that I don't think we need scientifically, as you'll see. One of the reasons for this is the verse from Genesis 1:28, when God finally finishes the land animals, and he says, God blessed them, said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. Now, in the 1700s, 1800s, and today, when we hear the word replenish, we're thinking it was once full, and now I gotta put more stuff in. Whether it's a storage bin in your pantry, or a storage bin in a factory, or the whole earth, something happened, like Lucifer's flood, and we've got to replenish the earth. But the interesting thing here is that's not a good understanding of that word. In 1611, that's when the King James was first translated, right? The word replenish in the English language did not mean to do it over. It just means fill completely. Fill completely. It did not imply a previous filling. It just says, now I have this space, or I have this people available, now go out and fill the earth. Not like it was already once full, but just fill it. And in English, we've come to think of the word re, or the prefix re, as something that has to be done again, but that was not the case until later in the 1600s. It did not imply a previous filling, so that kind of a misinterpretation of that word led to some confusion as part of the gap theory. It was not until after 1650 that the word came to mean fill again, the way our common thinking is. So that's just an interesting point about that confusion, the gap theory. We could spend all night talking about it, but I'm just going to go on. Another theory is the day-age theory. Well, you know, these days of creation, they're just kind of a God's outline, but we don't know if it was really each 6 individual days, 6 rotations of the earth. Each day could be a long time. So each day is an age, an eon of time. So we stretch out those days. I'm going to get into why I don't like that, and maybe you don't either, but here's, you know, just a little stylized cartoon, the gap theory, the day-age theory. Theistic evolution, that basically accepts the idea that God used evolution, which has a lot of theological problems that I don't think get well addressed for those who hold it. Now, I don't mean to step on anybody's toes, but I understand that theistic evolution is part of what's now called the framework hypothesis. And that's been around for probably close to 100 years. I have some of the dates, but I haven't put it on the screen here. But anyway, it is popular among many evangelical theologians. I emphasize theologians and philosophers. They think science has proven the earth is millions and billions of years old, and near the end we'll address a little bit of the science. But it's an attempt also then to fit that in, let God use evolution over millions and billions of years, and therefore we need some way of explaining it in light of what they think science has proven. And so they borrow from that time period and call it, we need to understand biblical creation in the light of ancient Near East poetry. Now, I have other Hebrew experts, and you can find them at Is Genesis History and others, a lot of great interviews. And they all say, even those that don't necessarily believe it, but they say the Hebrew text is an historical narrative. It's an historical narrative. It's not poetry. And there are those who say, well, we need to understand it in light of ancient Near East poetry, other cultures living at the time of Moses or afterwards that'll help us. And part of it, the reason for the word framework, is that you get two triads. Day 1, 2, 3, God's creating the cosmos or different space. Day 1, he creates space. Day 2, he creates the atmosphere. Day 3, he creates land. And then on day 4, he fills that space with the stars and the sun and the moon. That corresponds back to day 1. Day 5 now is the animals of the air and the sea. That corresponds to the emphasis of day 2. And then finally day 6, the land creatures, because the dry land appears on day 3. So you get that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pattern. They could explain it much better than I'm trying to do here, but you get the idea, a triad. And that way they can accommodate secular belief in billions of years. So many theologians present this structure as evidence that Genesis 1 is symbolic rather than literal presentation of creation. But as I said, a lot of Hebrew scholars say, there is parts of Hebrew in the Bible, like obviously Psalms and Proverbs, that are meant to be poetry. But not so at Genesis, including chapter 1, 2, 3. It's a narrative, and that's how it's written according to other Hebrew experts. There are a lot of people who do not agree with the framework hypothesis. Some of you may have heard of John MacArthur, radio personality, famous pastor. He does not agree with it. He says this implies a structure of the chapter is poetic, and according to the theory, you can even change the sequence of creation and just change it. You can disregard that sequence because you can play games with it. Now, I met a young scholar from Trinity who was there visiting on a scholarship, and I was trying to get to him to understand some of the science that you don't need the framework hypothesis. I told him, now wait a minute, I'm an engineer, I've been studying this. And he just didn't listen to me. He didn't want to listen, but he kept telling me about this triad structure. And then at a luncheon, he looked at me and said, not only do I need ancient Near East poetry to interpret the Bible, in other words, an extra biblical source of pagan cultures that God actually said to destroy. Remember when the Israelites took the land? But I need them, and therefore I can accommodate not just millions and billions of years in Genesis 1, but I can change the order, the sequence of events. I almost fell off my chair when he said that. Because, how can you have a high view of Scripture and then go around changing it, the sequence of events even, to what you think is better? And I'm sorry, I just can't go there. So that's why John MacArthur finishes and says the problem with the framework hypothesis is that it employs a destructive method of interpretation. And if you want to read more about it and understand it, as well as explain why it doesn't work, Kenneth Gentry has written an excellent book. He's also opposed to the framework hypothesis. He's a doctorate in theology as well. And his book, as it is written, dismantles the framework hypothesis. So I'm just trying to give you a little overview of the alternate views. And they are sincere people, intelligent people that hold to these views. But as I look at Scripture, I'm sorry, I can't go there. And then as I look at science, I don't need to. And we'll get into that, okay? So we get into the actual days of creation, and one of the common things is that the days of creation all have a number. There was evening, there was morning, the first day, the second day, the third day, and so on. And in Hebrew, every time you put a number with the word yom, everybody say yom. Yom. That's the Hebrew word for day. Now, it could mean a long time. But whenever you put a number with it in Hebrew, it means an ordinary day. The first day, the second day. When you put a number with it, and when you actually put morning and evening, or even just one of those phrases in it, then it definitely means, and all the times it's used in the Old Testament, it always means an ordinary day. So I think right here you've already got a good indication from the scripture itself that God is implying, he's talking about, I did this in 6 days, 6 rotations of the earth, and how that worked, I'll get to it. Here's another theologian. He said this: if the hundreds of other cases in the Old Testament when Yom stands in conjunction with an ordinal number, first, second, third, like I said, also in Exodus 12, 24, Leviticus 12, it never means anything than a normal, literal day. That's what Dr. Raymond says. And then recently there was a new Hebrew English lexicon, and when they went to define the word Yom, a day defined by evening and morning, just like in Genesis, and they give their references to Genesis 1. So there are Hebrew experts that just can't go along with some of these other explanations. They're saying, wait a minute, that's not what the Hebrew is saying. It's not. And if God did mean long ages here, there are other Hebrew words he could have used. And I think when it comes to the original manuscripts, in the original Hebrew and Greek, God says what he means and means what he says. So he could have used, if he didn't want us to think of 6 literal days, he could have used this Hebrew word. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce it, but it's a long time or age or an eon. Here's the next one. It means to the 1000th generation. In other words, long periods of time. Another Hebrew word, thousands or myriads of years, eons of time. He could have just said that about this time period, a long time ago, in these eons I did this. But he didn't. He said, first day, and there was morning and there was evening, using the word Yom. So he doesn't do that. He just doesn't. So let's go to day 1. We've got that opening statement. God created the universe, or the heavens and the earth, but he's saying the universe, the cosmos. And then he jumps right into this next thing, this connective word, and. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, and God said, let there be light. There was light. So initially, we just have, and you get into it, a form and a face of the waters. So what do you have? I would imagine, just going straight by what it says here, is a blob of water that's still dark and has no shape. Just water. And then God said, let there be light. So he's introducing energy. What does that mean? I'll mention a little more. And he called that good and divided the light from the darkness, called the light day, the darkness he called night, evening and morning the first day. So what do we have at the end of day 1? When God introduces the energy or acts somehow on day 1, and he says the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, that means it's not just a void blob of water anymore. It's most likely a sphere. That means gravity is working. You can only have a surface to the waters if it's now taking a shape and not a mist or just a blob of water molecules. But that all is happening in day 1, and then God says he creates light. Let there be light. We don't know where the light came from. Was it God himself? But he's creating light energy. And of course, he says, in the beginning. This is when time began. So the 3 things that he creates is matter, but only water so far, energy, or light energy, and time. Those are the very 3 things that Big Bang Theory would like to explain at the beginning. God says this is how he did it, and that's what he did on day 1. Now we've got a form to the water. we got a form to the water, and it's spinning. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the morning and evening. Okay? Now, then he says, let there be light in this day, and I would say that's the entire light energy spectrum. Why not? It can't just have to be visible light, which is a very narrow part of the light spectrum as we know it today. We go from very tight short waves, gamma rays, X-rays, ultraviolets, to the infrared, and even microwaves are in this with the longer wavelengths, and to radio waves. That is the light energy spectrum, and that's how they describe it in secular astronomy places. That's where I took this picture. That is all of light, and God says he did that on day one. What's the source of the light? Well, in 1 John 1:5, he says, God is light. In him there is no darkness. So is God himself the light for the first 3 days? Well, he provided it one way or another. And is it similar to what God does in the end times, in the new heaven and the new earth? Remember, Revelation 22:5 says, there will be no more night. They will not need the light of a lamp or the light of the sun. For the Lord God will give them light, and they will reign forever and ever. So we won't need a sun when the new heaven, the new earth is made. God is our light. So that's just a clue as to the source of the light. But here's the point I want to make, and for you to consider as you look over in your own studies into Genesis 1. At the end of day one, what is there? What does the whole universe look like? And we're only talking about step one in a longer engineering project. Step one, make my raw materials, begin time. Boom. I start spinning it, and I got a giant ball of water, and that's all there is. And light energy, directional light. That's all there is. And the guy's then going on to the next step when he begins day two. So think about that. When he says the universe is created on day one, step one in that process is simply matter in the form of only water. And if you go through those first few verses, I think it'll make sense. He mentions nothing else but water, and it has a surface. The Spirit of God hovers over the surface of the waters. He's looking at what he's starting. He's getting excited about it, just like any good engineer when you finish phase one of a project, right? So now let's go on to phase two. And God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. Again, the only thing that's there is water, H2O, which is an amazing molecule. And God made the firmament, divided the waters under it and above. God called the firmament heaven. So basically, what is this heaven? It's not earth, but what he's creating is the Hebrew word rakia. Everybody say rakia as you see it up there. See, now you're Hebrew experts. You know two Hebrew words, yam and rakia, right? They empty space. It's defined as an expanse, an empty space. He's taken most of that water, creates an empty space in it. He divides the waters. That's all he says he's doing. And we know the universe is expanding, or a lot of people believe that. What's it expanding into? If it's getting bigger, there's something on the other side, right? Well, maybe just God himself. Who knows? We don't know. My point is, he is now creating this massive empty space, leaves a little bit of water in the middle, maybe a few globules in the empty space, but most of it now is expanding roughly, very quickly, to the size of the universe we know today, or something a little bit less, and it continues to expand, which a lot of astronomers believe. Either way would work at this point. So think about that. At the end of day two, what do we have? An expanse between the waters. It's empty. Does it have a fabric to it? Some people think today that there is a fabric to space. 80 years ago, they called it the ether. They don't use that word today because they don't want to seem old-fashioned, but the way they describe it, the current astronomers, they're describing the ether. Something is in the fabric of space. Something we think some of them can measure. My whole point is the universe as we know it is still not existing. End of day 2, all we have is a huge outer shell of water that obviously when you go to 13 plus billion light years in the radius, it's going to be stretched out a lot. And he separates this. The space in between becomes what we call outer space. And the center ball becomes the Earth, as you'll see in the next steps. Now, to help you understand this, give you a little review, I've asked Dr. Humphreys to send us a video of his explanation of this. Actually, this comes from a CMI video. It's just a 3.5-minute clip. But tell you about Dr. Humphreys. He was raised in an atheistic home. He did physics and research in nuclear physics, light and magnetism. He didn't become a Christian until he was a grad student at LSU. And then in his adult life, he's been a speaker at NASA, universities, churches. He's published 20 different papers in secular scientific journals, and he's the author of Starlight and Time, Evidences for a Young World. If you're familiar or been around the Young Earth Creation movement, he is a mover and shaker and looks at things like Starlight and Time. And I've had the privilege of inviting him to speak at conferences and meetings, and he is a very kind Christian gentleman today, and very smart. Some physics professors were trying to fence with him verbally over atomic particles. And not only did he keep up with them, he was ahead of them in explaining things, and they couldn't finish. But listen here, this is Dr. Humphreys now.
Our starting point is going to be the Genesis deep. What was the deep in Genesis 1:2? The verse reads, "And the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the face of the waters." So you notice the last word is waters, so you get the strong impression that the deep is water. Notice also over. Over means there's an up and a down. That means gravity is working. The fact that the waters have a face, a surface. If you put a blob of water out in a total vacuum and there's no gravity, it's going to be very fuzzy, lots of mist, there won't be a surface. But the fact that there's a face of the deep, face of the waters, means that there's gravity at work. So this tells us something else, that the deep was a big ball of water. And so because gravity would pull the water into a sphere surface. This is quite different from the Big Bang theory. The deep is dark to begin with. The Big Bang starts with a big flash of light, and it doesn't start with water, it starts with plasma. In the Big Bang theory, the Earth doesn't come along until 10 billion years after the Big Bang. Here, we have the Earth formless and featureless right within the deep. Genesis 1:6 says, "And God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters." So note expanse and note midst. What's an expanse? In Hebrew, the word is rakia. In the Greek Septuagint, it's stereoma. In the Latin Vulgate, it's firmamentum. And the King James translators got their word firmament from firmamentum. But all these words mean something that is spread out. So there's a something spread out, and notice he's starting it in the midst of the waters. Somewhere down at the midst, I can't show it real small, he made a space, a little demarcation. And then the waters above the expanse moved outward, and the expanse expanded. And right now, I think the waters above the expanse are at least 14 billion light years above us. So, what the Bible says is beyond the stars is water. By the way, God called the expanse heaven. So there's no mistaking what he meant by the expanse. It's a big empty space where the stars are going to be. I know that there are waters above, partly because of Psalm 148, verse 4, which reads, "Praise him, highest heavens, and the waters that are above the heavens." So the earth is near the center of this configuration. And how do we know that? Because remember, when he made the expanse, he made it near the center or the midst of the ball of water.
Okay? Got the first 2 days. What do we have at the end of day 2? Step 2 in our big engineering project. An expanse between waters, an outer shell, very big and thinned out. And the middle part becomes what we know of as the universe. The center ball of water becomes the Earth. And it expanded obviously rapidly and probably is still continuing to expand today, so some people are beginning to question that. But we do have this expanse at the end of day 2. Again, all the matter is still only water. So we get to day 3. Oh, what's going to happen next? Well, God said, "Let the waters under the heaven," now that's referring to the waters in the midst, what's under the rest of the heavens, "be gathered unto one place, and let dry land appear," and it was so. And God called the dry land earth, the gathering together of the waters he called seas, and God said it was good. But then he's not done on day 3. He says, "Let the earth bring forth grass, herbs yielding seed, and fruit tree yielding fruit after its kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth," and it was so. So what's happening here? As he brings forth grasses and herbs. So the land is transformed from the waters. I think on this day, God decides I'm going to need some land on this little ball of earth that I'm going to concentrate on. And it's going to become, he transforms the H2O to all the other elements of the periodic table. That's to make the land. He's got to transform it or create it from fresh, not sure which, but he's now making silicon, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, all the heavy elements other than H2O, and creating a landmass. And today even, secular geologists talk about the Earth having, in its past, just one continent. And that's what seemed to get here. And then he builds plants on the land, and we can take on the edges of the land and in the waters. But I want to emphasize, a lot of times we think, well, this is the day God created plants. But if you go through that list, that's not what God says. He doesn't say he creates plant life, all the plant life on the land and the seas. Now he gives a kind of a specific list, and you can dig into that if you want, but a theologian actually told me this. If you read what he describes and makes for plants on day 3, you get one list of plants, and then you jump to chapter 2, you get another list of plants. And we'll talk about why that's important. So Earth gets a landmass, and we get plants, but not all plants are yet created. Okay, now we go to day 4. Okay, we've got this big empty space. God's got something cooking now on the earth. Got this big empty space. What am I going to do with that? Poof, this is where he starts to fill it. That's why he couldn't create, in this process anyway, in this sequence of events, he needed a place to put the galaxies, the suns, the stars. And God said, let there be lights in the firmament. This is expanse. The rakia is going to be now filled up. The firmament of the heaven to divide the day from day and night, and let them be for signs and for seasons, for days and years. And those are all very important things about celestial navigation, our seasons, our things. And so around the earth, he builds the whole solar system. He puts the sun in, starts the orbits, puts some planets in, the moon, which is also very important for life on earth. He's got to have that, the lesser light, he calls it. And now we have it. And that makes our seasons as he spins it up, making the solar system. And finally, let these lights be, and he gave light upon the earth. Now we have a unique source of light, the sun for the earth. And then God said he also made the lesser light. And just kind of an aside, oh, he made the stars also. Right? And he gave them in the firmament of the heaven. This is this expanse. And the stars, what are their purpose? To rule, well, it was for navigation and the seasons and signs. So at the end of day 4, instead of this empty space, this rakia, he makes the stars also. He creates the solar system like a giant gyroscope. I think that's why some of those outer planets are big. It all helps with the stability of the entire solar system, if you know anything about how gyroscopes work. And that's what the solar system is like, as I look at it. And he got all that spinning. A lot of evidence that our little arm of the Milky Way galaxy is still fairly close, not the exact middle, but fairly close to the middle of our universe. If you get into redshift theory and so on, and the different galaxies as they are spaced around us. But he does create the other galaxies, and God is creative. He obviously loves a myriad of colors in that light energy that he made, and different types of light energy. So we have all kinds of things going on in space. This, on day 4, he populates that empty rakia with what we now see. And he needed that empty space before he can start populating it. Well, it makes perfect sense to me. I'm going to build a shed and put all kinds of good stuff in my backyard. And when I need to get the building materials and the foundation, build an overall expanse before I can start putting other stuff inside of it. I think that makes sense, at least to me as an engineer. Now, the amazing thing about water, and water being the first thing created, is that if you did any research on it, there's all kinds of studies on how amazing water is. Water can appear to be fine-tuned for life. That's what a Japanese engineering study said just a couple years ago. They didn't want to say it looks like it's designed for life, so they used the word, it appears to be fine-tuned for life. Well, maybe it is fine-tuned for life. It's a special molecule. I believe it's the only liquid where the solid becomes less dense than the liquid when it freezes. And if you understand all that, that's an important thing just for a fish to survive in a pond or even a large lake. It has the highest heat capacity of any liquid. That helps temper our seasons, and why the coast, even up north, can be warmer in the winter and cooler in the summer. It's got a very unique surface tension that some insects can even walk on water because of that surface tension. And it's a universal solvent. It dissolves more things than any other liquid. A chemist friend of mine said that, it is totally different. Just below oxygen in the periodic table is sulfur. And there is an H2S. But when it freezes from liquid, it gets denser. And yet water, when it freezes, gets less dense. That's why your ice cubes float in your soda pops. And of course, it allows fish to survive underneath the ice. If all the ice was forming and dropping down, it would trap them. So water is very amazing. And other articles start talking as we look around our universe, at least as far as we can look in the solar system, they're saying, oh, in space, there's water everywhere. Oh yeah, if that's the first thing God created, it makes perfect sense to me. The moon Europa, one of the moons of, I think that one's Saturn, we've now discovered that it's got an outer ring of water to it. So does Ganymede, Jupiter's biggest moon. In fact, they think Ganymede has more water than the Earth does. Water is everywhere, they're telling us. Titan, another moon, and of course comets. You've all heard that comets are, dirty snowballs, a lot of water. And this is right from another website, science website, says water everywhere. There's lots of hints about this in the universe. So it is a common thing. It makes perfect sense that that's the first thing God created and then transformed everything around it. Now, I'm going to stop a little bit and address Big Bang Theory. Now, in the middle 20th century, it became obvious to astronomers that the universe had a beginning. Many of them didn't like that. They were in that camp, at least, they were all atheists. They say, if you say the universe has a beginning, that sounds like there might be a God. Like, might have created it. It began. In the beginning, God... Oh. They didn't like it, but it became so obvious, they had to agree, okay, the universe had a beginning, and it appears that the universe is expanding rapidly. Some people say at the edges even faster than the speed of light, or at least after the Big Bang. Faster than the speed of light, which is hard to put your mind around. But these were both confirmed observations in the middle 20th century, and they are consistent, and they knew it, with the Bible. The Bible talks about He stretches the heavens. Some people think that's only past tense, so is he still stretching them? We don't know, but he certainly stretched it taut, like a tent. He stretches the heavens like a curtain. He makes it tight. He opened it up. That was the rakia, the fabric of space. So both science and the Bible agreed it, but of course, secular scientists don't want anything to do with God. So the rest of Big Bang theory was developed to explain a beginning and an expanding universe without God. And what happens after a while when you try to do things without God? You get into trouble. You really do. So I'm just, we could spend another hour on this one alone and still not cover it, but the Big Bang theory does have some problems. Everybody knows that the cosmic microwave background supposedly proved it because it was a prediction. Well, there's some problems with that. First, the prediction had a different temperature than what we found, so they changed the model. And then they tell everybody, okay, see, it predicted it. But the real point is this. If you have a theory as big as Big Bang theory, I mean, that's supposed to cover everything, right? Well, it has to make lots of predictions that you could glean from that theory, right? And most of those predictions have been falsified, and I'll just give you 4 tonight, okay? 1, there's not enough antimatter. There's no explanation for the very first stars, where they come from. Galaxy formation, got some issues there, and then supernova remnants, and we'll get into that. So the first one was antimatter. Now, all the equations that they tried to develop for Big Bang theory says if you convert energy to matter, theoretically, you should get 50-50 equal amounts of matter, antimatter. And in the lab, we have actually done little bits of conversions of energy and getting little bits of matter, but right next to it is the antimatter. And that makes sense. Antimatter, how many know what that is? Got a couple of hands going up. Antimatter is what powers the engine of the Starship Enterprise, right? Well, it is. Because when antimatter, which has a negative charge in the middle, instead of protons, it kind of has negatrons. They're a negative charge, and the little particles spinning around it, instead of electrons with a negative charge, they're positive. So it's a real thing. It's not imaginary. There is antimatter, and it's just a reversal of those charges. And when you make it from pure energy, energy doesn't think, I got to make only matter. It thinks, boom, I'm going to get 50-50 of both. But what happens when they touch? Kaboom! Exactly. And that's, of course, the energy that powers the spaceship or the spacecraft Enterprise and all the other Star Trek things. So beam me up, Scotty. Let's check that antimatter engine out. But it is a real thing. So, however, this is a problem because you do get equal amounts, both theoretically and in practice. And yet, when we look around the universe, this prediction of Big Bang theory has been falsified. We look around, there's almost all matter. Where's the antimatter? Oh, but that would be a problem, and you'll see why. We look around the universe and we see matter, and where is the antimatter? There should be equal amounts. You got the difference between the orange-green and the blue-purple dots, matter and antimatter. They should be roughly 50-50. And yet we don't see that much, if any, antimatter. Very, very little. And it's a good thing. God said he's going to make matter. Started with water, and then the rest of the table of elements on day 3. This is what we see, very little antimatter. And this is a problem for Big Bang theory. This is James Klein. He's a McGill University physicist, and he's rather prominent, and an American scientist. He said, where did matter come from? The best theories of the origin of the universe still fail to explain how it managed to not turn up empty. Because if you do get matter and antimatter at the end of the Big Bang, and then they start touching, boom, 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 you've got nothing. So this is one prediction from Big Bang that's been falsified, and that hurts the theory. You don't need a lot of falsified predictions. You really should start questioning your theory, if not giving up on it. And that's why Big Bang theory has so many band-aids. There have been people, secular physicists, astrophysicists, that have been complaining about Big Bang theory for decades. And they keep adding things, and there's a lot of problems. And just give you a couple more here that gets more to the day 4 creation of galaxies. We can see some galaxies. How many of you have seen pictures like this? A galaxy with the pretty spiral arms? Now, those galaxies that aren't that far, and we're talking maybe, I don't know, a few 100,000 light years, not millions, but they're out there. They have nice spiral arm galaxies. And according to galaxy and star formation, they should be quite old. And the light that we see them didn't take that long to get here. Okay, if you assume that light travels in deep space at the same speed as we can measure on Earth. That's a key assumption. This gets to the whole question of being able to see distant starlight. Well, the first problem is these spiral arm galaxies, we can measure how fast they're spinning, and the inner stars spin much faster than the outer stars, and after a couple rotations, and we can get a good idea of how fast they're spinning, the spiral arms ought to be gone, indistinguishable. They should be a blob. So spiral arm galaxies that should be very old and yet have basically middle-aged spiral arms shouldn't be there. They should be more in the middle, a little further out maybe. Then there's the issue of distant galaxies. We've been able to find more and more of them. These distant galaxies, if you believe that light travels at the same speed in deep space as it does on Earth, then if this galaxy is, let's say, 10 billion light years away, then it should have taken 10 billion years to get here, right? Everybody follow that? So the light we are seeing is coming from when that galaxy was in its infancy, not long after the Big Bang. It should have only population, I think it's population 3 stars, which have no heavy elements. The first stars had no heavy elements. The Big Bang could only make hydrogen, a little bit of helium and lithium, nothing else. And yet the light from these distant stars, we can analyze it, and it shows signs of heavy elements. And many of them are spiral arms. And they have calculated, well, wait a minute, this takes, a billion, few billion years, and you couldn't start because the universe after the Big Bang would be too hot. You got to wait a while for everything to cool down, gases to coalesce, stars to pop into existence, and then arrange themselves into a spiral arm galaxy. That all takes, a few 100 million years, if not more. And even then, if that light is 10 billion years old, when we're seeing it, it should be in the early stages of a galaxy being born. And yet everywhere we look out there, whenever there's a spiral arm galaxy, it looks like the close ones. That's a problem. There's a problem with that assumption. These galaxies with spiral arms that are varying distances apart, they should be in all different stages of their so-called stellar and galaxy evolution, and they all look too much alike. They can't be. It can't have taken 10 billion years for that light to get here because it looks older than my assumption would indicate. Got it? So that is a problem. This is a real observational issue that shows that these galaxies further out means there's something wrong with our assumption that it took 10 billion light years for that light to get here. It looks too young. It looks, it should be young, but it looks older than the evolution of galaxies should be. So I think this is a real observation that there's something wrong with the assumption as well as the formation of the universe, especially since that we know that they have heavy elements in them, in their stars. So you get the idea? You've got a problem here. I think there is something wrong with the assumption of sunlight, light traveling at the same speed that we can measure on Earth in deep space. And we know light is affected by time and gravity. So Dr. Humphreys, he uses a little bit of Einstein's theory of relativity. And yes, they may experience a little more time out there because they're in stretched space that's being held taut. And what did Einstein teach us when you stretch space? You also stretch time. So maybe they experienced a few million years, because we do see them in some points of collision and other things, but not billions. And certainly, all that can happen and the light get here in Earth years, in 6,000 Earth years. And that's the key. I know it's a little hard for us to wrap our heads around it, but when you get into relativity, and even science fiction movies today talk about different time dilations and different time frames when you're traveling in deep space compared to Earth time. And that's all it is. And I think that's the best explanation, and young Earth creationists have other explanations that are very good. And a lot of the explanations that with the problems with Big Bang Theory are not so good, actually. Here's just another comment on these galaxies. This is a PhD in physics from George Mason University. Dr. Trefil said there shouldn't be galaxies out there at all. And even if there are galaxies, they shouldn't be grouped together the way they are. The problem of explaining the existence of galaxies has proven to be one of the thorniest in cosmology. By all rights, they just shouldn't be there, and yet there they sit. It's hard to convey the depth of frustration that this simple fact induces among scientists, at least scientists in the know about this problem, right? Dr. Silk from University of Oxford said, many aspects of the evolution of galaxies cannot be determined with any certainty. In other words, we don't know. Though when they teach our children, they're very confident. We know exactly how this all happened. And that brings us to star formation. How did the first stars form? If all you have is clouds of gas. The popular theory is that stars form from vast clouds of gas and dust. Wait a minute, where'd the dust come from? All I got is hydrogen, a little bit of helium and lithium. Gases, no dust yet. They say, well, dust was formed when a star goes supernova. And that's when you get the heavy elements, right? But wait a minute. What about the first star? That's an important question and a very important distinction. So they believe that these stars eventually spinning around in space, and they're coalescing, and they start getting closer and closer, these clouds, getting all the elements closer and closer and closer, getting they're spinning and spinning, and then gravity grabs them, and they start pulling in on each other. And of course, that only works if you have the dust, which is other than those gases. And then they can work it and put it together, and then poof, a star is born. And they don't mean the Barbra Streisand movie, right? But does gas clouds want to do that? You know, basic physics says gas, if there's nothing containing it, it wants to expand. Fred Whipple, a very famous astronomer, said precisely how a section of an interstellar cloud collapses and gravitationally into a star is still a challenging theoretical problem. Astronomers have yet to find an interstellar cloud in the actual process of collapse. Another physics professor said, the complete birth of a star has never been observed. The principles of physics demand some special conditions for star formation and also for a long time. A cloud of hydrogen gas must be compressed to a sufficiently small size so that gravity dominates. But in space, however, almost every gas cloud is light years in size, hundreds of times greater than the critical size needed for a stable star. As a result, outward gas pressure causes these clouds to expand, to spread out. Exactly what you would predict based on PV equals nRT, right? The basic equations of gases. So they still say, well, you know, there's big clouds of gas out there. There's enough out there to make a lot of stars. And this one here, that's a star nursery. You've heard that, right? And they make it sound like we've seen stars ignite, but we have not. We don't have video on the news tonight, new star being born. These are still pictures, and they have very long exposure times. And so we don't know if some of these pinpricks of light in the middle of that center gas cloud, which is gigantic, is that a star in front of it, a small star, a brighter star behind it, or something in the middle? They just say, well, that must be a new star. But as you can see, we've already had secular astronomers admit we've never seen that. We've never seen that. David Milan from the observatory, Anglo-Australian Observatory, said, images taken by the European Southern Observatory Very Large Telescope in January 2002 of the Horsehead Nebula in Orion, the Orion gas cloud, verified that the structures are expanding. Exactly what you would expect gases to do. The same thing for the Eagle Nebula. In Science, an article said on the formation of sun-like stars, despite numerous efforts, we have yet to directly observe the process of stellar formation. The origin of stars represents one of the fundamental, unsolved problems of contemporary astrophysics. And of course, you know, chemistry 101. Heated gases expand. Stellar evolution is not real. Gravity can't contract a cloud of space gas into a star. Walt Sivertson, one of the original founders of this Midwest Creation Group and a very intelligent man. He loves doing the math. He walked me through some of this. And when you get contracting gases, they naturally heat up, but they want to expand. And as at various temperatures, depending on the one you pick, that gas cloud doesn't contract further. It wants to expand with a force 60 to 100 times more than gravity could pull it in. So we just don't see it. We should, but we do not see stars. Isaiah 40:26 says, lift up your eyes on high. Behold, who hath created these things, that brings out their host by number and placed them into the rakia. He even knows them by name, which means there's a limited number. You see, we've never seen a star being born, but the interesting note is we have seen a star die. What happens? What do we call it when a star dies? A nova or a supernova. And so when a star explodes, we can see some of the remnants. We know in some of these things, here's the Crab Nebula. It was documented as super bright light in 1054. And light from the supernova at least reached the Earth in 1054. You can guess when it actually happened, but there's different ways to do that. The point here is we can identify the remnants of supernova. And we've had them explode. We do get the different elements. We get fusion stops, star explodes, and we've seen them in 1054 as well as 1604 and as recently as 1987. Supernova remnants, the remains of a dead star, really. So, how many, if there's billions and billions of stars, and you can look at them from the universe, we should be seeing thousands of them being born every night. We don't see any. And occasionally we see some die. And if there's billions and billions of them, and if the universe is billions of years old, how many supernova remnants can we detect out there? Well, if you believe in a billion-year-old universe and it all correlates to a billion-year-old Earth and we see everything, well, they have different definitions. The first stage supernova remnant is something that occurred in the last 100 years. And they would predict 2 if the universe was billions of years old. Second stage is thousands, anything from several hundred years to thousands of years old. Supernova remnants should be out there, and if they really did happen in this time frame and the universe was billions of years old, over that time, stars being born and dying, we should see 2,260 second stage supernova remnants. And if the universe is billions of years old, then anything over 1,000,000 years ago of age, we should have at least 5,000 supernova remnants that we can detect with our telescopes and look out there and start counting. And people do this. People actually do. But if the universe was 6,000 years old, we would predict only 2, that'd be the same prediction, 2 in the last 100 years, but only 125 in thousands of years, because we have a limit on how many thousands of years, right? 6,000 years. And none that occurred millions of years ago. So, as we count these, what do you think the actual number is? And you've got 2 quite different predictions here. Well, the actual number of first stage is 5. Okay, close enough to 2. Both models are working. Second stage, we got 200. Oh, well, that's pretty close to the 6,000. We're off by a factor of 10 from the second stage prediction for billions of years. How many do you think we have in the third stage supernova remnants left that we can identify? A big 0. Oops. And this can be done again and again. Supernova remnants is a strong evidence that that universe out there is not that old. And somehow we are seeing these things, and we are. And there should be a lot of this third stage, but can't see them. What's a good way to double check this is a galaxy that's far away. Excuse me, I believe these were for the Milky Way galaxy, our galaxy, okay? Now, in the southern hemisphere, if you look in the sky, we have a good view of the Large Magellanic Cloud. That's another galaxy, the LMC, Large Magellanic Cloud. You can see it well in the southern hemisphere. And the interesting thing is, we have a fairly good side view of it. They're basically a big disk, right? And we have a good side view, so we can see all of it. And looking in the Milky Way, we're kind of at one of the edges, so it's hard to see all the way around. The Large Magellanic Cloud, we have a good view from the side. We've got telescopes now that can help us analyze this quadrant by quadrant by quadrant. And so you can do the same thing. The Large Magellanic Cloud, we've got an idea of how many stars it has, and even though it's a different galaxy, we can make predictions. We should be able to see 2 first stage supernova remnants, 2,200 again, and even 8,000 third stage supernova remnants in the Large Magellanic Cloud. If the cloud was only 6,000 years old, the predictions would be, again, 2 for the hundreds of years, thousands of years, 50 to 75, and then zippo for the millions. What do you think we found? And people do count this. Well, we don't have a good count for the hundreds of years because of the distance. But second stage remnants are only 54, right in the middle of the young Earth prediction. And how many third stage supernova remnants do we find? Yeah, big 0. So we've got 2 different galaxies, supernova remnants that confirm a young Earth prediction. Interesting, isn't it? So this is what I looked at. Galaxies look the same age despite the extreme distances. Stars in all galaxies have heavy elements, and the number of supernova remnants in both our galaxy and the LMC is consistent with a 6,000-year-old Earth. Okay, now you can throw some time dilation in there and everything else, but this is actual observations, good predictions. To finish up the days of creation, animals that live in the sea and the air were created on day 5. Just a few pretty pictures here. And God says, let them multiply in the earth and the waters. And then there was evening and morning and the 5th day. What did God do on the 6th day? The last stage of our creation. Well, now he's going to get to the land animals. All the land animals. and the very best for last. So we're making land animals. What is the very best thing in creation? Well, mankind, but I'm being very specific. Gentlemen, what's the best thing, the best for last? Women! Yeah, ladies, you are the best for last. And that's what God saved you. He created mankind in his own image, separate, not starting with a monkey. He says, I did it from the basic elements that I created on day 3, the dust of the ground, and I made Adam. And then when Adam finally realized his need for a mate, he gave him Eve. And Jesus says, haven't you read in the beginning he made them male and female? Adam and Eve. You know, evolutionary theory has absolutely no explanation for the evolution of sexual reproduction. I don't want to get details, but there's a lot in this entire system on both sides, male and female, not just the outside, but the inside, the hormones, the enzymes, the fluids. It's all got to work as one system or it doesn't work at all. And they have no story for that. And yet every animal uses sexual reproduction. Simple cell just divides. That seems to be most efficient. Why would anything else be evolved? Land and animals are the best. And so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. And we go on through the rest. And then God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and morning the 6th day. Now, chapter 2 begins with the 7th day, but then there's a story, a little more details on the creation of mankind on chapter 2. This is one of the reasons some people think the framework theory makes sense, because it's a contradiction. How many of you heard an atheist say the creation, especially of plants and people, on chapter 2 conflicts with chapter 1? A few of you have. I've heard that. And that's why the framework people think, well, obviously, God can't create plants on day 3 and on day 6 with Adam and Eve. So that must mean that day 1 is just all allegory. It's poetic. But remember, I told you to look at that closely? In chapter 2, it says there's no shrub of the field and no plant of the field. If you get into the details, he's giving you a different list of plants. So I would suggest, and there are theologians that agree with this, getting into the Hebrew, that God created all the plants that we know of on 2 days. And specialized ones. The garden plants, carrots, and all the things that you need in vegetables, broccoli, asparagus, if you like that. That would have been the garden plants at least on day 6, not on day 3. And then you could probably add to that list as you think about it. So how many different days did God create plant life? Well, right now it looks like 2, but I would say 3. Day 3, he creates trees, different types of plants that have fruit with big seeds in them. And then here, and he gives a specific list. You can analyze it. This is a different list. Mainly the plants of the garden. There was no garden, so he had to do this, and now he's got man to cultivate it. We are meant to eat vegetables. But what happened after the fall, maybe a couple of weeks later? What was part of the curse when Adam and Eve sinned? You will toil, and that's when we have thistles and other weeds. So when I pull thistles and dandelions from my garden, I'm thinking, the fall, the sin of man, the 3rd time that God had to create something, only this time it was the negative side. So that's my take on Creation Week. I hope you found it interesting, a little bit of science to back it up. And really, chapter 1, God says in 6 simple steps, this is how I created the universe and everything in it. And it did take a multiple series of steps, a sequence. Day 2, he starts focusing on dealing with mankind, the crown of his creation, who he wants to have fellowship with, to love. And he gives man a soul. Men and women were meant to be related to God. But he gives us free will, and we fall into sin. And then the rest of the Bible basically just takes us from the beginning, but now focuses on dealing with mankind here on earth. We go all the way to Noah, the patriarchs. Finally, the promise is kept of a Messiah to save us from our sin. And now it's down to you. You see, Jesus loves you. He died for you. And he wants to save you, to restore us to that initial relationship that he called very good. So my question for you is, I mentioned that I became a true Christian, at least as I account, inviting Jesus into my heart. Where are you on that? You get this many people in the room. Maybe they're all Christians, maybe they're not. I don't know you. So I just ask you this. Have you ever asked Jesus into your heart to forgive you all your sins? That's what this is all about, as Ken mentioned. That's the first thing. And God has given us the ability to analyze his world, and as we look around the world, it matches what he says. Okay? Amen? Amen? If you've never invited Jesus into your heart, talk to somebody who invited you today, or talk to Ken. You can talk to me. I'll be at the book table. But do it. It's not hard. It's just a confession. Get on your knees next to your bed. Jesus, forgive me my sins. Come into my heart. Now, if you want more science, anybody been to the Grand Canyon? You ever been to the Grand Canyon and the park ranger pointed out at the rim? If you look way down there you can see the Colorado River, and just above it, that's where creation rock is. Then we have the Great Unconformity, and above that we have Judgment Rock. Did the park rangers point that out to you when you were there? No? That all that sedimentary rock laid down in Noah's flood over a year-long period? No, they didn't say that? Oh, well, join us on this trip and we'll point that out. You get the biblical interpretation. I got some flyers I'll put out there. And it's a trip where you get to just show up in Phoenix on June 10th, and we'll take care of everything: food, beverages, air-conditioned bus, nice hotels, no camping, but you do get a 17-mile raft trip. No whitewater, so anybody can do it. Just step into the boat, and then we go about 17 miles, and you get to experience being on the river between 1,000-foot cliffs on both sides of you. It's really awesome. You just can't stop taking pictures. Another commercial. If you're interested in astronomy, how many of you heard of Spike Spassaris? He was an engineer with NASA space program. He did a whole series of DVDs on creation astronomy. A lot more evidence. He goes through all of the planets of the solar system in volume 1 and points out, we're finding things. I know that secular scientists make predictions and they talk about these things, planets being billions of years old and formed from gas. But when we actually send space probes and we go there and we collect and analyze the data, every planet comes back with information that says, this planet looks young. These moons of Jupiter and Saturn look young. Even Pluto, when we were there with the Messenger spacecraft just a few years ago, looked young. They didn't know what to say. He goes through that. We got Stars and Galaxies, Volume 2, and then the whole universe. That's an amazing DVD by itself, number 3, because he goes through Big Bang Theory in detail and gives you a lot more of the problems and a little bit of humor and a lot of neat pictures as well. Got some more books back there. If you're interested in my DVDs, my talks, my teachings on some of these topics, like from dinosaurs, apes, science and the age of the earth, as well as atheism and the origin of life, I've got my talks on DVD that somebody put together and edited nicely. And if you don't want DVDs, because they're going the way of dinosaurs, right? I've got thumb drives. At a reduced rate, you get all 4 of those talks in an MP4 video, plus bonus materials, plus some PDFs on some of these various interesting topics. Some of you know about this brand new DVD, just came out a few weeks ago. I've got a supply of them there.